We will be switching gears from the epistemology to metaphysics, and specifically looking at the question, does God exist? So what is our definition of God? Well, I'll be using the sort of God of the Abrahamic religions, the God of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, and mostly because most of Western philosophy works with this conception of God. So what's some necessary conditions for being this type of God? Well, first, he needs to be omnipotent, meaning he has to be all-powerful. He has to be omniscient, meaning he's all-knowing. And he has to be all-good, or you could say omnibenevolent. And all these omnis, I'll just call him the omni-God for being concise. Reasons for belief. So there's at least 3 reasons for belief. You can believe because you've utilized reasons, evidence, and arguments for your position. You can believe on faith, which is belief without, or actually in sometimes in spite of evidence. Or you can believe because revelation, which is a purely subjective reason for belief. We'll concern ourselves with the natural religion because that's where we can get into the arguments for and against the belief that God exists. So belief and knowledge. They can sometimes be a bit confused. Belief, in our case, we'll talk about theism, which believes in a god or gods. The other belief position would be atheism, a lack of belief in a god or gods. Then we have knowledge, which is different. We have Gnostic, but not to be confused with that early Christian sect, the Gnostics. When I mean Gnostics, I mean someone who claims to know, because Gnostic means knowledge in Greek. So someone who claims to know God exists. And the other knowledge position is agnostic, which is someone who suspends judgment on the knowledge claim, who says, I'm not sure if God exists or not. I don't know. So, what are some reasons for agnosticism? Well, some reasons for suspending judgment are that there are equally good evidence for and against the existence of God, so you're kind of unsure of which is true. Or there's equally bad evidence for and against the existence of God. And for the agnostic, the burden of proof rests on the one making the knowledge claim. They don't have to defend their agnosticism. So let's look at some of these combinations of belief and knowledge positions. Agnostic theism is one who believes in a God, but does not claim to know that there is a God. Then we have Gnostic atheism, someone who lacks a belief in a God and claims to know that no God or gods exist. Agnostic atheists lack a belief in God, but also suspend judgment of the knowledge claim that God exists or God does not exist. They don't claim to know that. Then we have Gnostic theists that not only believe in a God, but also claim to know that a God exists. So let's jump into the overview of these classical arguments. First up is the arguments for the existence of God, and the first one of these is the ontological argument, most popular by St. Anselm. And of course, before I go any further, these are probably not the best arguments out there. These are just the classical arguments from which many of the modern arguments draw from. So St. Anselm argues that knowing God exists is sort of this a priori experience, which is essentially using rational deduction rather than empirical evidence to come to the conclusion that God exists. So he argues all that one needs to do is reflect on the concept of God, and the concept of God reveals his existence. It's a bit kind of weird and confusing, but we'll get more into this for the next video, and hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense. So a modern example, really, that I could find is Alvin Plantinga's modal ontological argument, if you want to check that out. Then we have the cosmological argument. Probably the classical, most famous one is by Thomas Aquinas and his Summa Theologica. And it's the first 3 of his 5 ways. Everything demands a causal explanation. All causes have started from an uncaused cause, which is God. A modern example, of course, would be the Kalam cosmological argument by William Lane Craig. So we have the teleological argument. It's also known as the argument from design. A classical version of this would be from William Paley, and it basically argues that the complexity of the universe reflects a designer, which is God. Then we have a moral argument, which can be found in the works of Plato. It's not exactly an argument, but more of a consideration that moral truths need to be grounded by a standard, which is the gods, or in our case, God. Pascal's Wager by Pascal, of course. He admits that there's no way to prove or disprove God's existence, but we need to bet one way, and he argues the best bet is to bet that God exists. Then we have the popularity argument, which basically argues whatever the most amount of people believe is probably true, and since the most of people on Earth believe that God exists, they believe it is true, and the truth explains their belief, so whatever the majority believe is true is probably true. It's not really an argument that you can tie down to one specific source. It's probably just one of those common arguments that you often hear. Alright, let's look at some basic arguments for against the existence of God. So of course we have the problem of evil. Basically, there's an unnecessary amount of suffering, especially to those who are innocent, and there cannot be an omni-God because of that. So there's at least 2 forms of these. We have the illogical version of this, which tries to show that the existence of an omni-God and evil are somehow logically contradicting each other. So both existing is impossible. And then we have the evidential argument, which is the evidence of suffering around us makes the existence of an omni-God not impossible, but improbable. At least nowadays, you tend not to see a lot of these logical arguments, but you tend to see mostly evidential arguments. Then you have the paradox of the stone. So it's either the case that God can create a stone so heavy he cannot lift, or he cannot create such a stone. Just read it through and you'll see the paradox right away. Then we have the dilemma of God's foreknowledge and free will, which argues if God knows all things, even the future, and if God knows what I will do, then how can I choose to do otherwise? So if God knows what I'll do in the next 5 minutes, how can I not do that in the next 5 minutes? How do I have free will not to do that? And that is all for the review. I'll leave you with a few questions that I'm very curious about. What is your position on the question, does God exist? And what argument do you think is best for your position? Please answer that in the comments section, and with any other questions or comments that you may have. Up next, we'll look at St. Anselm's ontological argument in a bit more detail. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you give it a like, leave a comment, and subscribe to be updated on my uploads. See you next time.